A kingdom ruled by fear, she was the sacrifice, a peasant girl thrown to a monster wearing a crown. They whispered he had killed his first wife, that servants who displeased him disappeared in the night, that he delighted in cruelty for its own sake. As Alara walked toward her wedding, her trembling hands hidden in the folds of her gown, she knew she was marching to her doom. Every story, every rumor about King Aldrich painted him as a tyrant whose heart had long since turned to stone. But monsters aren't supposed to show vulnerability. They aren't supposed to watch their brides with eyes that hold questions instead of malice. And they certainly aren't supposed to approach on the wedding night with unexpected gentleness. When the dreaded moment finally arrived and they stood alone in the royal chamber, Alara prepared herself for violence, only to find herself frozen in confusion when the cruel king simply looked at her and whispered, "Are you afraid?" What happens when the monster you've been taught to fear reveals a humanity no one believed possible? And what terrible secret could transform a kind prince into the cruel king whose name makes the kingdom tremble? The brush tore through her hair with such violence that Alara bit her lower lip until she tasted blood. Around her, 5 ladies in waiting worked in mechanical silence, transforming a trembling peasant girl into a queen. None met her eyes. Their hands moved with practiced efficiency, yet something in their hurried movements betrayed their own fear, as if preparing livestock for slaughter. Through the stone walls, the distant church bells tolled, each ring hammering another nail into her fate. Alara's heart thrashed against her ribs like a caged bird sensing death. She couldn't breathe. The jeweled corset they'd forced upon her body crushed her lungs, a perfect metaphor for what awaited her. A life of suffocation under the rule of a monster wearing a crown. "The lamb delivered to the wolf," a gray-haired lady whispered to another, not quietly enough. The words lingered in the cold chamber air, mingling with the scent of rose water they'd bathed her in. A futile attempt to mask the stench of terror that clung to her skin. A violent tremor seized Alara's right hand. She watched it shake as if it belonged to someone else. This betrayal of her body confirming what her mind already knew. She was nothing but a sacrifice. Her father had offered her to the king in exchange for their village's protection, a transaction as simple as trading a sheep for a bag of grain, except the sheep knew its fate would end quickly at the butcher's blade. Her suffering would be measured in years. The heavy footsteps of armored guards echoed down the corridor, growing louder. Metal against stone, doom approaching with methodical precision. One of the ladies flinched at the sound, nearly dropping the pearl hairpin she was fixing into Alara's auburn waves. Their eyes met briefly in the polished silver mirror, a flash of genuine pity quickly extinguished. No one dared show sympathy for the king's chosen bride, not if they valued their position, not if they valued their lives. Stories of King Aldrich's cruelty traveled faster than wildfire through the kingdom. They said he'd once had a servant's fingers cut off for spilling wine on his boots, that he made examples of those who displeased him by displaying their punishment in the castle courtyard, that his first wife had disappeared after only 3 months of marriage, her name forbidden to be spoken within the castle walls. Some whispered she had taken her own life to escape him. Others believed something far worse. Alara's mind drifted to her home as the ladies draped the heavy wedding cloak across her shoulders. She remembered the smell of fresh bread from her mother's oven, the gentle bleating of goats in their small pen, the laughter of children playing in the village square. Simple pleasures now lost to her forever. A tear escaped, trailing down her cheek. One of the ladies quickly wiped it away, her touch firmer than necessary. "No crying," she hissed. "His Majesty despises weakness." The door swung open with a groan of ancient hinges. 2 royal guards stood like stone sentinels, their expressions empty beneath their helmets. Between them stood the royal steward, a thin man with calculating eyes who regarded Alara as one might inspect a newly acquired horse. "It is time," he announced, his voice devoid of emotion. The walk through the castle corridors felt endless. Every step on the cold stone floor echoed her heartbeat, too fast, too loud. The guards' heavy footfalls matched her own, a relentless rhythm driving her forward. Servants pressed themselves against the walls as they passed, averting their eyes. Some made the sign of protection against evil when they thought she wouldn't notice. Did they pity her, or fear that the king's cruelty might be contagious? Perhaps both. Her mind replayed fragments of conversation overheard during her week at court. Courtiers whispering behind jeweled hands. Poor creature, she won't last the month. The king tires of his playthings quickly. Better her than my daughter. Each memory was a fresh wound, salt rubbed into already raw flesh. The great hall loomed before her, its massive doors thrown open to reveal hundreds of candles blazing within. The heat hit her first, suffocating, intense, followed by the weight of 1,000 eyes turning to watch her entrance. The assembled nobility of the realm, dressed in their finest, gathered to witness her sacrifice. Not a single face showed compassion. Some looked curious, others amused, most simply indifferent. These people had watched countless others fall victim to their king's wrath. She was merely the entertainment of the day, and there he sat, King Aldrich, the cruel one. Upon the dais, his throne seemed to dwarf even his considerable frame. Dark eyes watched her from beneath a heavy brow, his bearded face impassive as stone. No smile, no scowl, nothing to reveal what thoughts lurked behind that impenetrable mask. The crown sat upon his head like it had grown there, gold and rubies gleaming in the candlelight. His hands, those hands rumored to have strangled men for sport, rested casually on the ornate arms of his throne. Each step toward him felt like wading through river mud. Ilara's legs threatened to buckle beneath her. The modest peasant girl, now draped in silks and jewels that felt as heavy as chains, approaching the man who held absolute power over her future, her body, her very life. A copper taste filled her mouth. She'd bitten her lip again without realizing. The ceremony passed in a blur, words spoken, vows exchanged. Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears, a trembling whisper nearly lost amid the vastness of the hall. The king's voice, by contrast, rang clear and commanding, claiming her as his own before God and kingdom. When he placed the queen's circlet upon her head, his fingers brushed against her temple. She fought not to recoil from his touch. The feast that followed was a grotesque display of excess. Roasted meats, exotic fruits, wines flowing like water, all while she sat beside him, unable to swallow a single bite. The king ate little, drank less. His attention seemed focused elsewhere, his responses to congratulations curt and dismissive. Not once did he address her directly. Not once did his eyes linger on her face or form. It was as if she were already a ghost. When the call came for the bedding ceremony, Ilara felt her world narrow to a pinpoint of terror. Ladies giggled as they led her away, stripping the finery from her body and replacing it with a thin nightgown of nearly transparent silk. Their hands were not gentle. Their words were not kind. "Try not to cry too much," one whispered. "It only excites him more." The royal bedchamber was cavernous and cold despite the roaring fire. Tapestries depicting hunting scenes covered the walls, men on horseback pursuing desperate prey. The massive bed dominated the center, its dark wooden posts carved with scenes she couldn't bear to examine closely. The sheets had been turned down, awaiting their bodies, awaiting her blood. Left alone, Ilara stood shivering in the center of the room, arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt at protection. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Each creak of the castle made her flinch. Each flicker of firelight cast monsters in the shadows. When the door finally opened, she couldn't suppress the small cry that escaped her lips. King Aldrich entered alone, having dismissed the traditional male escort. He'd removed his crown and formal robes, dressed now in a simple black tunic that still couldn't disguise the strength in his broad shoulders. The door closed behind him with terrible finality. Ilara dropped into a deep curtsy, eyes fixed on the floor, willing herself not to collapse entirely. "Your Majesty," she whispered. Silence stretched between them. When she could bear it no longer, she dared to lift her gaze. The king stood watching her, his expression unreadable. Not rage, not lust. Something else entirely that she couldn't name. He crossed the room toward her with measured steps. Each footfall seemed to echo her heartbeat. She closed her eyes, bracing for his hands upon her body, for pain, for the brutality everyone had warned would come. Instead, his voice reached her, low and unexpectedly gentle. "Look at me," he commanded. Ilara forced her eyes open, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. What she saw there wasn't the savage cruelty she'd expected, but something far more complex, a darkness. Yes, but also a question. "You are afraid," he said. Not an accusation, a simple statement of fact. She couldn't lie. "Yes, Your Majesty." The king moved closer, close enough that she could smell the cedar and clove scent of him, could see the faint scar running along his jaw. His hand rose toward her face, and she couldn't help but flinch. He paused, letting his hand fall back to his side. "They have told you stories about me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About what I do to those who displease me. About what I will do to you." Ilara said nothing. What could she say that wouldn't condemn her? The king turned away, moving toward the fire. The flames cast his face in sharp relief, highlighting the weariness she hadn't noticed before. For a moment, he seemed almost human. "I wonder," he said, staring into the flames, "what you would do if you knew the truth." Before she could question his meaning, he turned back to her. Something had shifted in his demeanor, a decision made, a mask replaced. He approached her again, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head to maintain eye contact. His hand rose once more, this time gently, so gently she could hardly believe it was the same man, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked, his voice so soft it was almost tender. "Yes." The word hung between them like a confession. Ilara didn't lower her eyes as she spoke, though every instinct screamed for her to do so. Something in his question demanded honesty, and she had offered it, despite knowing the danger. The air in the royal bedchamber seemed to crystallize around them, time suspended in the space of a breath. King Aldrich's expression remained unreadable. He stepped back, creating distance between them that felt both like mercy and abandonment. Without a word, he moved to the far side of the massive bed and turned his back to her. The muscles in his shoulders tensed visibly beneath his tunic as he removed his outer garments, leaving only loose sleeping clothes. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the gentleness from moments before. "Sleep. Dawn comes early to the castle." Ilara stood frozen, her nightgown clinging to her sweat-dampened skin. Was this a trick? A test of obedience? Her pulse thundered in her ears as confusion replaced terror. Every whispered warning, every horrific rumor suggested she should be fighting for her life, or at least her dignity, at this moment. Instead, the dreaded king had simply turned away. She slipped beneath the heavy covers, positioning herself at the very edge of the mattress. The sheets were cold against her skin, the distance between their bodies vast enough to fit 3 more people. Neither spoke again. Sleep eluded her entirely as she listened to his breathing, waiting for it to change, for him to suddenly remember his husbandly rights. The night stretched endlessly, her body rigid with anticipation of violence that never came. Morning light crept through the narrow windows, finding Ilara still awake, eyes burning from exhaustion. The king rose without acknowledgement, dressing quickly behind a wooden screen. He emerged transformed. Gone was any trace of the man who had asked about her fear. In his place stood the monarch feared throughout the kingdom, his face a mask of cold indifference. Crown settled upon his brow like a physical manifestation of his power. "You will attend court today," he stated, voice clipped and formal. "The Queen's presence is required." Without waiting for a response, he swept from the room, leaving only the lingering scent of cedar and clove behind. Ladies-in-waiting materialized almost instantly, their curious eyes darting between Ilara and the rumpled but clearly undisturbed side of the bed where she had spent the night. Their hands were gentler today as they dressed her in the heavy finery of her new station, but their silence spoke volumes. The bed linens were inspected, whispers exchanged. One maid's eyebrows rose slightly before her companion silenced her with a sharp glance. "Is there something amiss?" Ilara found her voice stronger than she expected. The oldest of the women, gray-streaked hair pulled severely back from her lined face, met her gaze directly. "There is no blood on your sheets, Your Majesty." Heat rushed to Ilara's cheeks. "The king," she began, then stopped, unsure what to say. What could she say? that the fearsome ruler had asked if she was afraid, then simply gone to sleep. "The king's ways are his own," the woman finished for her, voice low enough that only Alara could hear. "But the court has expectations, and eyes everywhere." Throughout that day, Alara felt those eyes following her through the castle's vast corridors. Courtiers bowed deeply as she passed, their respect perfunctory, their whispers beginning the moment she moved beyond earshot. Servants stared openly, their usual discretion abandoned in favor of assessing the woman who had survived her wedding night with the cruel king. In the great hall, seated beside Aldrich on a slightly smaller throne, Alara observed how differently he carried himself among his subjects. His voice rang with authority as he passed judgments and heard petitions. His face remained impassive as he sentenced a thief to lose 2 fingers, neither pleasure nor regret visible in his features. When a nobleman spoke out of turn, Aldrich's cutting response left the man pale-faced and stammering apologies. The court alternated between silent terror and nervous laughter, desperate to align themselves with the king's apparent mood. Not once during these proceedings did he acknowledge her presence beyond formal introductions. She might as well have been another ornament upon the dais, decorative but inconsequential. Yet when a young courtier approached to offer Alara flowers, the king's hand tightened imperceptibly on his throne's armrest, a flicker of something dangerous crossing his features before the mask returned. "The queen appreciates your gesture," he stated flatly, dismissing the youth before Alara could accept the blooms herself. The days that followed established a pattern. In public, King Aldrich maintained careful distance from his new queen, acknowledging her only when protocol demanded. His reputation for cruelty remained unchallenged as he ruled with an iron hand, unmoved by pleas for mercy, unwavering in his judgments. In private, he retreated to his own chambers each night, after ensuring Alara was settled in hers, their marriage unconsummated, their conversations limited to the barest necessities. Whispers grew throughout the castle. Servants exchanged knowing glances when Alara passed. Ladies tittered behind their fans during court gatherings. Even the guards seemed to watch her with new interest, as if trying to determine what flaw had made the king reject his bride so completely. "Perhaps she displeases him physically." Alara overheard one courtier murmur to another as they walked the garden paths ahead of her. "Or perhaps he cannot perform his duties," came the snickering response. "They say true monsters are often impotent in the bedchamber." Shame burned through Alara, hot and sudden. She was failing at the one thing she had been brought here to do, to be the king's wife in truth, not just in name. Yet beneath the humiliation lurked confusion and a growing sense that something far more complex than disinterest explained the king's behavior. On the 7th night of their marriage, Alara gathered her courage and approached the door connecting their chambers. Her hand trembled as she raised it to knock, her throat tight with anxiety. Before her knuckles could meet the wood, she heard voices from within, the king's deeper than the other, both speaking in urgent, hushed tones. "The northern borders cannot hold without additional forces," the unfamiliar voice insisted. "I will not strip the eastern garrisons to strengthen the north," Aldrich replied, his tone revealing more emotion than Alara had heard from him in public. "The threat of rebellion there is too great." "Your father would have—" "My father is dead," Aldrich cut in sharply. "And I am not him." Alara stepped back from the door, breath caught in her throat. Something in the king's final words carried such weight, such buried pain, that she felt like an intruder witnessing something never meant to be seen. As she retreated, a floorboard creaked beneath her foot. The voices inside ceased immediately. She hurried back to her bed, heart racing, pulling covers up just as the connecting door swung open. Through slitted eyes, she watched Aldrich enter alone, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on her seemingly sleeping form. For a long moment he simply stood watching her, an unreadable expression softening his features in the dim candlelight. When he finally left, closing the door quietly behind him, Alara released the breath she'd been holding. In that unguarded moment, she had seen something impossible to reconcile with the man who ruled by fear, vulnerability, perhaps even sorrow. The following morning in court, Alara found herself studying her husband with new awareness. She noticed how he flinched almost imperceptibly when servants approached too suddenly, how his eyes darted to exits before settling into conversations, how he positioned himself always with walls at his back. These were not the habits of a man who enjoyed wielding power, but of one who expected attack from any quarter. When their gazes happened to meet across the crowded hall, something unexpected occurred. It was Aldrich who looked away first, his eyes dropping as if unable to bear her scrutiny. In that instant, understanding dawned on Alara with staggering clarity. The king was not avoiding her touch because she disgusted him. He was not keeping distance out of cruelty or disinterest. The truth was far more astonishing. Beneath his carefully constructed facade of merciless strength, King Aldrich, the ruler feared throughout the land, was terrified. And somehow, inexplicably, part of what frightened him was her. The realization settled over Alara like a physical weight. The cruel king was not her jailer. He was himself imprisoned by something far greater than the crown he wore. And for reasons she couldn't yet fathom, he had allowed her close enough to glimpse the bars of his cage. The sharp cry of a night bird pierced the silence, startling Alara from her pretense of sleep. Midnight had long since passed, yet slumber remained a distant luxury. 3 weeks into her marriage, and still she lay alone each night, listening to the castle's ancient whispers. Tonight, however, something was different. The connecting door to the king's chambers stood ajar, just slightly, allowing a thin blade of candlelight to slice across her floor. Through that narrow opening came the unmistakable sound of movement, the soft pad of footsteps, the rustle of fabric, the quiet clink of glass against metal. Alara held her breath, counting heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. She slipped from beneath the heavy covers, her bare feet silent against the cold stone floor. The thin linen of her nightgown offered little protection against the castle's perpetual chill, raising goosebumps across her skin. Peering through the crack between door and frame, she caught a glimpse of her husband, not as king, but as man. His crown and royal garments discarded, he moved with a heaviness that transformed his powerful frame into something almost fragile. His shoulders hunched forward as he poured dark wine from a crystal decanter, swirling the liquid before drinking deeply, his throat working as he emptied the goblet in one desperate swallow. The scent of wine, strong, almost medicinal, wafted through the gap. Not the delicate vintage served at royal banquets, but something harsher, as if chosen for function rather than pleasure. Alara watched as Aldrich refilled his glass, then moved to stand before the window. Moonlight carved harsh shadows across his face, illuminating eyes that held none of the calculated coldness she had come to expect. Instead, they brimmed with something that made her chest tighten. Raw, undiluted pain. She stepped back, a floorboard groaning beneath her weight. The sound, though slight, echoed like thunder in the midnight stillness. On the other side of the door, movement ceased. Alara froze, heart hammering against her ribs. When Aldrich resumed his pacing, she released her breath in a silent rush of relief, retreating to her bed on trembling legs. Sleep claimed her eventually, troubled dreams filled with her husband's haunted eyes. The next night, and the next, Alara found herself awake, listening. A pattern emerged. The king would retire to his chambers when court business concluded, but would not remain there. Shortly after midnight, his door would open and close with practiced quietness, his footsteps fading down the corridor beyond. Each night he departed. Each night he returned hours later, the sharp bite of wine clinging to him like a second skin. Curiosity burned within her, stronger than fear. On the 7th night, when his footsteps receded into silence, Alara made her decision. Wrapping a heavy woolen shawl around her shoulders, she slipped from her chambers and into the darkened hallway. The castle transformed after nightfall. Shadows danced in the guttering torchlight, turning familiar passages into labyrinthine mysteries. Alara pressed herself against tapestried walls whenever servants passed, holding her breath as they carried night soil or fresh kindling, their tired faces illuminated briefly before disappearing around corners. She followed the path she imagined Aldrich would take, away from the royal apartments, down the grand staircase, through the portrait gallery where dead kings watched with painted eyes. A faint glow ahead drew her forward. Keeping to the shadows, she glimpsed her husband's tall figure moving with purpose, unaware of her presence. The broad expanse of his back betrayed tension in every line. He no longer walked like a king here. There was no performance, no careful posturing. This man moved like someone carrying an invisible weight, each step measured against exhaustion. Aldrich turned down a narrow corridor Ilara had never noticed before, one hidden behind a weathered tapestry depicting a hunting scene. She waited until he disappeared from view before following, her pulse quickening with each step. This passage was older than the rest of the castle, the stone worn smooth by centuries of passage. No torches burned here, only moonlight filtering through arrow-slit windows illuminated her way. At the corridor's end stood a simple wooden door reinforced with iron bands, unremarkable compared to the ornate entryways throughout the rest of the castle. Yet something about it sent a chill racing along Ilara's spine. This door held secrets, important ones. The sound of a key turning in a lock echoed softly. Through the gloom, she watched Aldrich produce a key from within his tunic, unlock the door with practiced ease, and disappear inside. The faint glow of candlelight briefly spilled into the hallway before the door closed behind him. Ilara crept forward, driven by a need to understand that transcended caution. What lay beyond that threshold? Instruments of torture, confirming the darkest rumors about her husband. A hidden treasury. Or perhaps something far more personal. The thing that put such anguish in his eyes when he believed himself unobserved. She pressed her ear against the rough wood. Silence, then. A sound so unexpected it nearly made her gasp aloud. A voice, Aldrich's voice, speaking softly, conversationally, as if addressing someone inside. Yet no response came. Was he talking to himself? Or to someone who could not or would not answer? Minutes stretched like hours as Ilara debated her next move. The sensible choice would be to return to her chambers, to forget this nighttime excursion. If caught spying on the king, what punishment might she face? The stories of his cruelty flooded back, fingers severed for spilled wine, tongues removed for careless words. Yet even as fear coursed through her veins, a deeper certainty took root. The man she had glimpsed these past nights, vulnerable, haunted, human, did not align with the monster of legend. Something was hidden here, something that might explain the contradiction that was her husband. Heart pounding against her ribs so loudly she feared he might hear it through the door, Ilara lowered herself to her knees. At the door's base, a narrow gap, barely the width of her smallest finger, allowed a sliver of candlelight to escape. She pressed her eye to this opening, holding her breath. The room beyond was small by royal standards, circular, likely housed within one of the castle's lesser towers. No opulent furnishings or treasures met her gaze. Instead, simple rushes covered the floor. A single chair stood beside a small table bearing wine and a lone candle. But it was the far wall that drew and held her attention. There hung a portrait, modest in size but exquisitely rendered, of a young woman. Even through the limited view afforded by the gap, Ilara could see the subject had been beautiful, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold both wisdom and mischief. She wore no crown or royal insignia, her dress simple yet elegant. Something in her smile suggested warmth, intelligence, strength. This was no passive court beauty, but a woman of substance. Before this portrait knelt Aldrich, his back to the door, shoulders shaking with silent emotion. One hand reached toward the painted face, fingers stopping just short of touching the canvas, as if fearing the image might dissolve at his touch. His voice, when it came again, was thick with unshed tears. "Another week without you," he whispered. "Another week of pretending." The raw anguish in those words pierced Ilara's heart. She watched, unable to look away, as her husband, the feared king, the cruel tyrant, wept before the portrait of a woman long dead. His body curled forward, pride and power stripped away, leaving only grief so profound it transcended time. "I'm so tired, Isabel," he continued, his voice barely audible. "Tired of being what they expect, what they fear. Tired of wearing his face, speaking with his voice. Sometimes I forget who I was before he made me this." Isabel. The name struck Ilara like a physical blow. No one in the castle ever mentioned the king's first wife by name. It was as if she had been erased from history, her very existence forbidden from memory. Yet here was Aldrich, night after night, keeping vigil before her image, speaking to her as if she might answer. "I took another wife," he confessed to the silent portrait. "The alliance was necessary. She's young, afraid, looks at me the way everyone does, like I'm a monster ready to devour her." A bitter laugh escaped him, hollow and painful. "Perhaps I am. Perhaps that's all that's left." Alara's chest tightened, breath catching in her throat. She should not be hearing this. These words were not meant for her ears, this pain not meant for her to witness. Yet she remained, transfixed by the revelation unfolding before her. Aldrich raised his goblet to the portrait in a macabre toast. "To the Monster King and his Ghost Queen," he murmured, before draining the wine in a single swallow. When he lowered the empty vessel, something had changed in his posture, a squaring of shoulders, a straightening of spine. Even from behind, Ilara could sense the transformation, the vulnerability receding behind walls of carefully constructed strength. He rose slowly, bones cracking like a man twice his age. For one terrifying moment, he seemed about to turn, to discover her spying presence. Ilara pulled back from the gap, pressing herself against the corridor wall, heart thundering so violently she feared it might burst from her chest. Blood roared in her ears, nearly drowning out the sound of Aldrich's movement within the chamber. When she dared look again, he stood directly before the portrait, his forehead pressed against the frame, eyes closed in an expression of such profound longing that Ilara felt her own eyes burn with unshed tears. This was not the face of a monster. This was the face of a man shattered by loss, held together only by the thinnest threads of duty and determination. "Good night, my love," he whispered to the painted face. "Until tomorrow." The flight back to her chambers left Ilara breathless, heart hammering against her ribs with each hurried step. By some miracle, she reached her bed moments before the connecting door creaked open. Through slitted eyes, she watched Aldrich pause at the threshold, his tall silhouette outlined by dying candlelight. For several agonizing heartbeats, he simply stood there, watching her feigned sleep, before withdrawing without a sound. Only then did she release the breath trapped in her lungs, her mind reeling with what she had witnessed. Isabel. A name now burned into her consciousness. A ghost whose presence haunted not just the hidden chamber, but the very foundation of her marriage. Morning arrived with watery autumn sunlight and renewed determination. As her ladies dressed her in the heavy brocades befitting a queen, Ilara studied their faces, searching for one she might trust. The eldest, Agnes, had served the royal household for over 3 decades, her lined face a map of palace secrets. The king's first wife, Ilara began carefully, watching Agnes's reflection in the polished mirror. "I've heard so little about her." The room froze. One lady dropped a hairpin, its metallic clatter against stone deafening in the sudden silence. Agnes's weathered hand stilled on Ilara's sleeve, her eyes darting to the others. "Leave us," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for question. When the chamber door closed behind the younger women, Agnes turned Ilara to face her, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "We do not speak of Queen Isabel within these walls, Your Majesty. It is forbidden." "By whom?" "By the king himself." Agnes glanced nervously toward the door. After her death, he ordered her name struck from court records, her portraits removed. Even mentioning her could earn severe punishment. "Yet you just did," Ilara observed. A ghost of a smile touched the older woman's lips. "I am old enough to remember a different king, and old enough to risk his wrath." She paused, fingers fidgeting with the fabric of Ilara's gown. She was beloved by the people, kind, intelligent. Some said she had more wisdom at 20 than the old king had acquired in 60 years of rule. "How did she die?" Ilara asked, pulse quickening. Agnes's face clouded. "Suddenly, during the 4th year of their marriage, there was talk of illness, but..." She shook her head. "I have said too much already. Please." Ilara caught the woman's gnarled hand in hers. "I need to understand." The old woman's eyes searched hers, measuring something Ilara couldn't name. "They were deeply in love," she finally whispered. "A love rarely seen in royal marriages. Then the old king died and Prince Aldrich became King Aldrich. After that, everything changed. Before Alara could press further, a sharp knock announced the return of the other ladies. Agnes stepped back, her face resuming its careful blankness, leaving Alara with more questions than answers. Throughout the day's court proceedings, Alara found herself studying Aldrich with new eyes. The cruel king's mask remained firmly in place as he settled disputes and issued proclamations, his voice ringing with authority that brooked no argument. Yet now she noticed the slight tremor in his hand when Isabel's home province was mentioned in a trade agreement. The momentary distant gaze when a courtier with dark hair similar to the portraits entered the hall. When court adjourned, Alara took a calculated risk. As Aldrich rose to leave, she approached him directly, something she had never dared before. Courtiers parted before her, surprise evident on their faces. The king himself stiffened as she drew near, his expression warning her to retreat. "A moment, Your Majesty?" she asked, pitching her voice for his ears alone. His dark eyes narrowed fractionally. "What is it?" Alara swallowed, acutely aware of the watching court. "I found a portrait last night," she said quietly. "Hidden away in the North Tower. A beautiful woman with dark hair. I wondered who she might be." The effect was immediate. Color drained from Aldrich's face, replaced by a fury so cold it seemed to lower the temperature of the entire hall. His fingers clenched around the throne's armrest, knuckles whitening with strain. "You were wandering the castle at night?" he asked, voice dangerously soft. "I couldn't sleep," Alara replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "The door was unlocked." A lie, but a necessary one. She watched as disbelief flashed across his features, quickly masked by something far more frightening. Fear. Not of her, but of what her discovery might mean. "That wing is restricted," he said, loud enough now for nearby courtiers to hear. "You will confine yourself to appropriate areas of the castle henceforth." "But the portrait," she persisted, "is none of your concern." His voice cut like a blade. "Do not speak of it again, to anyone." With that, he swept past her, leaving a wake of whispers in his departure. Alara stood frozen, heart pounding, aware that dozens of eyes now assessed her with renewed interest. The public confrontation, however minor, had accomplished exactly what she had hoped and feared. The court had witnessed their exchange. The wall between king and queen had cracked, if only slightly. The consequences came swiftly. By evening meal, new rumors raced through the castle corridors. The queen had angered the king. The marriage was already failing. Some speculated that she would soon disappear, like others who had crossed Aldrich. A serving girl delivering bathwater whispered that several courtiers were placing wagers on how long Alara would survive the king's displeasure. "They say he's grown tired of you already," the girl murmured, eyes downcast. "That you'll be set aside before winter." "For another bride?" Alara asked, stomach twisting. The girl's eyes flicked up, then away. Or worse. Alone that night, Alara paced her chambers, torn between fear and frustration. She had glimpsed the man behind the monster, had seen his grief firsthand. Yet that same man had threatened her today, had reinforced his fearsome reputation before the entire court. Which was real? The broken man who wept before Isabel's portrait, or the tyrant who ruled through intimidation? Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Alara tensed, expecting Aldrich, but the door opened to reveal a stooped figure she recognized as Thaddeus, the ancient keeper of the castle keys. White-haired and rheumy-eyed, he had served 3 generations of kings, his loyalty to the crown legendary. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty," he wheezed, closing the door quietly behind him. "But there are things you should know, things about the king." Alara gestured him to a chair, but he shook his head, remaining standing despite his apparent frailty. "Why come to me now?" "I saw you today," he said, voice barely audible. "Asking about the portrait, about her." "Isabel," Alara whispered. Thaddeus flinched at the name, glancing nervously toward the shadows. "You walk dangerous ground, my queen." "Then why not warn me away?" Why offer information? The old man's gaze met hers, surprisingly sharp in his weathered face. Because I served King Aldrich before he became what he is now. I remember the prince he once was. Kind, just, beloved by those who knew him truly. His voice cracked with emotion. What you see now is not the man, but the shell that remains. What happened to him? Ilara asked, pulse quickening. What changed him? Thaddeus moved closer, his ancient bones creaking with each step. The scent of herbs and musty parchment clung to his robes as he leaned toward her, voice dropping to the barest whisper. The old king happened to him. King Magnus, may he rot in whatever hell claimed him, destroyed his son more thoroughly than any enemy ever could. The old man's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I've watched Aldrich become the very thing he once despised, wearing his father's cruelty like inherited armor. And Isabel? Ilara pressed, heart pounding. What happened to her? Thaddeus's face contorted with ancient grief. She tried to save him, to remind him of who he truly was. He shook his head slowly, but some darkness cannot be fought alone. Heavy footsteps in the corridor silenced him. With surprising agility, Thaddeus moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. His eyes, when they met Ilara's again, held both warning and plea. If you wish to save your soul, do not trust what everyone says about him, he whispered urgently. The truth is both simpler and far more terrible than the rumors. Find it before you judge him, or before his father's shadow claims you too. The door closed behind him moments before a guard passed, leaving Ilara alone with words that echoed like prophecy. The old man's warning, both cryptic and compelling, settled over her like a physical weight. The king she had married was not the monster of legend, but neither was he the man he had once been. Somewhere beneath layers of carefully constructed cruelty lay the prince Thaddeus remembered, and the husband Isabel had loved. The question that kept Ilara awake as midnight approached was whether anything of that man remained to be saved, or whether, in trying to find him, she might lose herself to the same darkness that had claimed him. 3 days of silence stretched between them, a gulf wider than the castle itself. Ilara felt Aldrich's absence like a physical thing, though he appeared dutifully at court each morning. He had retreated completely, taking his meals alone, conducting business with cold efficiency, retiring to chambers unknown rather than the royal apartments. The connecting door between their rooms remained firmly closed, locked from his side. Even the midnight pilgrimages to Isabel's portrait seemed to have ceased, or perhaps he had found another path to that hidden sanctuary, one beyond Ilara's awareness. The court watched their estrangement with predatory interest. Whispers followed her through the corridors, courtiers assessing her with calculating eyes that measured her remaining value in a failed alliance. The ladies assigned to her service maintained careful neutrality in their expressions, but Ilara caught the pitying glances they exchanged when they thought she wasn't looking. On the 4th morning, a messenger arrived as Ilara broke her fast alone in her chambers. The boy, no more than 12, with a shock of red hair and nervous hands, bowed awkwardly before delivering his message. "The king requests your presence at the tournament fields, your majesty," he stammered. "The royal guards are assembled for combat training." Curious despite herself, Ilara followed the boy through the winding castle passages and out into the crisp autumn air. The tournament grounds sprawled below the castle walls, normally reserved for festivals and noble competitions. Today, however, they hosted rows of soldiers in formation, swords flashing in the pale sunlight as they executed drills with mechanical precision. Atop a raised platform stood Aldrich, stripped of his usual finery. He wore only a simple tunic and breeches, dark with sweat despite the cool morning. In his hand, a practice sword moved with deadly grace as he demonstrated techniques to a circle of attentive captains. His voice carried across the field, authoritative, but without the cutting edge she had come to expect in court. Ilara watched, transfixed, as he stepped into the practice ring to spar with his master-at-arms. Gone was the rigid formality of the throne room, the calculated intimidation he wore like armor among courtiers. Here, his movements flowed with natural power, his focus absolute. When he disarmed his opponent with a complex maneuver that drew appreciative murmurs from the watching soldiers. A brief smile transformed his face, genuine, unguarded, reaching his eyes in a way she had never witnessed before. For an instant, Ilara glimpsed the man he might have been without the crown's burden. The Prince Thaddeus remembered. The man Isabel had loved. As if sensing her presence, Aldrich's gaze lifted toward the stands where she sat. Their eyes locked across the distance, his smile vanishing as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the familiar mask of stern detachment. With a curt nod to his captains, he handed off his practice sword and strode toward her, sweat-dampened hair curling against his neck in a way that made him seem strangely vulnerable despite his imposing stature. "You received my summons," he said when he reached her, voice carefully neutral. "I did." Ilara met his gaze steadily. "Though I confess I'm uncertain why you wished me here." Something flashed in his eyes, frustration perhaps, or resignation. "A queen should understand the kingdom's defenses," he said after a pause. "My father believed royal women too delicate for such matters. I disagree." The mention of his father sent a chill through Ilara, Thaddeus's warnings echoing in her memory. "And what else did your father believe?" she asked quietly. Aldrich stiffened, jaw tightening as if she'd struck him. For a moment, she thought he might walk away. Instead, he gestured toward the field where men continued their drills. "He believed that fear was the only reliable tool of governance," he said finally, voice so low she had to lean closer to hear. "That mercy was weakness. Compassion a luxury kings cannot afford." "And you?" Ilara pressed, heart pounding. "What do you believe?" His eyes met hers, dark with something that might have been pain or might have been warning. "I believe this conversation exceeds its proper bounds," he said, the momentary openness vanishing beneath royal formality. "You will join me for the evening meal in my private study. There are matters requiring discussion." With that, he turned away, calling orders to his men as he strode back toward the practice field. Ilara watched him go, the rigid set of his shoulders betraying tension that hadn't been present during the sparring match. Something in their exchange had unsettled him, or perhaps it was merely her presence, a reminder of vulnerabilities he preferred to keep hidden. The day passed with excruciating slowness, each hour stretching endlessly as Ilara anticipated their private meal. By the time a page arrived to escort her to the king's study, her nerves had frayed to breaking point, hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her gown. Aldrich's private study occupied a corner tower, walls lined with maps and ancient texts. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across a simple wooden table set for two. Not the elaborate royal dinner she had expected, but something almost intimate in its plainness. The king himself stood by the window, silhouetted against the deepening twilight, shoulders tense beneath his dark tunic. "You came," he said without turning, as if her attendance had been uncertain. "You commanded," Ilara replied, taking the seat a servant pulled out for her. "And if I hadn't?" Now he turned, firelight catching the angles of his face, softening the usual hardness around his mouth. "Would you have sought me out?" The question caught her off guard with its unexpected vulnerability. She began, then stopped, considering her answer carefully. "I believe I would have. There are questions between us that deserve answers." A shadow passed across his features. "Questions about Isabel." Her name, spoken aloud in his voice, seemed to thicken the air between them. Ilara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Aldrich dismissed the servants with a sharp gesture, waiting until the heavy door closed behind them before approaching the table. He did not sit, instead resting his hands on the carved back of his chair, knuckles whitening with pressure. "You've been speaking with Thaddeus," he said, not a question but an accusation. "He found me," Ilara corrected. "After our discussion in court. He oversteps his bounds. Or perhaps he remembers them better than most." She met his gaze directly. "He spoke of the prince you were, before the crown." Something dangerous flickered in Aldrich's eyes. "That prince is dead," he said flatly. "As dead as Isabel, as dead as any foolish ideals I once harbored about ruling with compassion rather than strength. Yet you mourn him still," Ilara observed quietly. "As you mourn her." His reaction was instantaneous and visceral, rage contorting his features for a heartbeat before control reasserted itself. "You know nothing of what I mourn," he spat, pushing away from the table with enough force to send his chair clattering to the floor. "Then tell me," Alara challenged, rising to face him. "Help me understand the man I've married, not the monster everyone believes you to be." "Perhaps they're right," he countered, voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Perhaps the monster is all that remains." "I don't believe that." The words escaped before she could consider their wisdom. "I've seen you when you think no one watches. I've heard how your voice changes when you speak to her portrait. That is not a monster, but a man in pain." For a moment, Aldrich stood frozen, shock evident in every line of his body. Then his face hardened, walls slamming back into place with terrifying finality. "You overreach yourself, wife," he said, the title sounding like an insult on his lips. "My private grief is not your concern, nor a tool for your manipulation." "Is that what you believe I'm doing?" Alara asked, genuinely wounded by the accusation. "Using your pain against you? What else should I believe? That you care for my welfare?" He laughed bitterly. "You were given to me as a political pawn, just as I was once offered to." He stopped abruptly, jaw clenching around words he clearly hadn't meant to reveal. Alara took a cautious step toward him. "Offered to whom?" "It doesn't matter." He turned away, moving toward the hearth where flames cast his shadow, elongated and distorted against the far wall. "None of it matters now." "It matters to you," she said softly. "Enough that you visit her portrait in secret. Enough that you've built your entire reign around becoming everything you once fought against." The silence that followed her words felt dangerous, charged with emotions too complex to name. When Aldrich finally spoke, his voice contained none of the cold authority of the throne room, but something far more broken. "Leave me," he whispered, not turning to face her. "Please." That single word, "please," stripped of royal command, naked in its vulnerability, struck Alara with unexpected force. Without thinking, she moved toward him, close enough to see how his hands trembled slightly at his sides, close enough to notice the barely perceptible rise and fall of his shoulders with each carefully controlled breath. "Aldrich," she said, using his name without title for the first time. "Whatever haunts you, whatever happened to Isabel, to you, it doesn't have to define who you are now." He turned then, eyes blazing with something between fury and despair. "You understand nothing," he hissed. "This crown, this throne, they demand their price. My father understood that. Isabel refused to accept it. And now—" His voice broke, the crack in his composure widening into a chasm of raw anguish. Alara watched in stunned silence as he moved to a small chest near the window, withdrawing from it a simple wooden box. With trembling fingers, he opened it to reveal not jewels or documents, but the royal crown, smaller than the one he wore for state occasions, but unmistakably the symbol of his daily authority. As he lifted it from its resting place, a remarkable transformation overcame him. His entire body seemed to shudder, powerful shoulders hunching forward as if under immense weight. The hands that had so confidently wielded a sword that morning now shook visibly, fingers spasming around the golden circlet as sweat beaded on his forehead despite the room's chill. "This," he whispered, voice barely audible, "is my prison, my father's legacy, the thing that killed the man I was, and the woman who loved him." In that moment of terrible clarity, Alara understood the truth that had eluded her. The crown did not serve Aldrich. He served it, enslaved by its weight and the blood-soaked expectations it carried. The cruel king was not the master of his realm, but its most tortured prisoner. Rain lashed against the castle walls, the sound of water striking stone a relentless percussion that masked Alara's footsteps as she paced her chambers. 3 days had passed since the revelation in Aldrich's study. 3 days of avoiding his gaze across the great hall, of pretending the vulnerability she had witnessed had been nothing but a momentary weakness. 3 days of questions multiplying in her mind like ivy climbing a forgotten tower, tangled, persistent, impossible to ignore. Lightning split the night sky, illuminating her chamber in harsh white light for a heartbeat, before plunging it back into shadow. In that flash, she caught sight of something unexpected. The connecting door to Aldrich's chambers stood ajar. Not locked as it had been since their confrontation, not closed in silent rejection, but open. An invitation, perhaps, or a challenge. The steady patter of rain against the window masked any sound from beyond that threshold, but the flickering glow of candlelight spilled across the floor like liquid gold, drawing her forward despite the warning voice in her head that whispered of danger. Ilara's fingers trembled as she pushed the door wider, the ancient hinges groaning in quiet protest. The king's chamber lay before her, cavernous and austere. No tapestries softened the stone walls, no ornate furnishings proclaimed royal status. Only the massive bed with its dark hangings and the great oak desk beneath the window spoke of the room's occupant. Before that desk stood Aldrich, his back to her, shoulders silhouetted against the storm-dark sky visible through leaded glass. He had discarded his formal attire, wearing only a simple linen shirt and dark breeches. Without the padded doublets and ceremonial cloaks that broadened his frame in public, he appeared almost human, powerful still, but less the untouchable monarch, more the man. "Did you think I wouldn't notice?" His voice came soft, yet clear above the rain's steady rhythm, though he hadn't turned to face her. "Your footsteps outside my chambers each night. Your breath held whenever I pass in the corridors. Your eyes following me in court." Heat rushed to Ilara's cheeks. She had thought herself discreet in her observations, had believed her growing fascination with the contradiction that was her husband remained her secret alone. "I meant no disrespect," she offered, the words inadequate even to her own ears. Now he turned, firelight casting half his face in warm light while leaving the other in shadow, a visual representation of the duality she had come to recognize in him. His eyes, usually guarded in her presence, held something new tonight. Not anger, not the cold calculation she had grown accustomed to, but genuine question. "What do you see when you look at me, Ilara?" The use of her name rather than her title hung between them, intimate in its simplicity. A tyrant, a monster, or merely a man? The question struck her with its raw honesty. This was not the practiced manipulation of court politics, but something far more dangerous. A genuine moment of vulnerability from a man who had built his reign on appearing invulnerable. Ilara moved further into the chamber, close enough to see the pulse beating at his throat, the slight tension in his jaw that betrayed how much her answer might matter. "I see both," she answered truthfully, "and neither. I see a man wearing a mask so long he's forgotten his own face beneath it." Something flashed in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or recognition. "And that doesn't frighten you?" "I don't fear your cruelty, Aldrich." The words formed themselves, rising from some place of certainty she hadn't known existed within her. "I fear your silence. The walls you've built that keep everyone, including yourself, at a distance." A bitter smile touched his lips. "Wise to fear that," he murmured, turning to pour dark wine into 2 goblets. "Silence has claimed better souls than mine." He offered 1 cup to her, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange, the first intentional touch they had shared since their wedding night. Isabel feared nothing, not my father's rage, not court gossip, not even... His voice trailed off, gaze drifting toward the window where rain traced erratic patterns against the glass. Ilara sipped the wine, its warmth spreading through her chest, emboldening her. "Not even what? Not even death," he finished quietly. Though perhaps she should have. Thunder rumbled in the distance, the storm moving closer. In its wake came a silence heavy with unspoken truths. Ilara watched as Aldrich moved toward the fire, flames reflecting in the depths of his wine as he swirled it absently. The habitual rigidity of his posture had softened, whether from the late hour or their unusual privacy, she couldn't tell. But something had shifted between them, a door cracked open that had previously been sealed. "They told me you were a monster before I ever saw your face," Ilara said, breaking the silence. "That you took pleasure in causing pain. That you ruled through fear because you enjoyed the power it gave you." She moved closer, close enough to see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight silver threading through his dark hair at the temples. "But I've watched you these past weeks. I've seen how you flinch when servants approach too quickly. How you position yourself in rooms to see all entrances. How your hand sometimes trembles when you reach for your crown. His head snapped up, eyes narrowing. You see too much. Or perhaps not enough, she countered. Tell me who you really are, Aldrich. Not the cruel king. Not the mask you wear for court. The man beneath. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, conflict evident in the tightening of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its royal authority, becoming instead the voice of a man confronting ghosts long buried. I was different once, he admitted, the words seeming to cost him physically. Idealistic, naive. I believed a king could rule through respect rather than fear, that justice could temper power. A humorless laugh escaped him. My father called such notions childish fantasies. He spent years trying to beat them out of me. And did he succeed? Ilara asked softly. Aldrich's gaze met hers, dark with memories she could only imagine. Not until he took Isabel, he said, the name a wound still raw after all this time. Not until he showed me exactly what happens to those who defy him. The implication hung in the air between them, terrible in its clarity. Ilara's throat tightened, words momentarily beyond her reach. Outside, the storm reached its peak, rain hammering against the stone walls like nature itself raging against the confession. She didn't die of illness, Ilara whispered, the truth crystallizing with sickening certainty. No. The single word fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of consequence spreading outward. She died because she believed in me, because she refused to accept the king my father demanded I become. His hand clenched around the goblet, knuckles whitening with strain. I couldn't protect her. I couldn't save her from him. And when she was gone, I made a choice. To become what he wanted, Ilara finished, heart aching for the prince who had died alongside his wife. To surrender. To survive, Aldrich corrected, his voice hardening. And to ensure no one else would suffer for my weaknesses. The cruel king needs no companions, desires no friends, loves no one who might become a target. He set down his goblet with careful precision, including his new queen. Understanding dawned with painful clarity. The distance he maintained, the coldness he displayed in public, the refusal to consummate their marriage, all of it designed not to punish her, but to protect her. From his father's lingering influence, from the court's watchful eyes, perhaps even from himself. Your father is dead, Ilara reminded him gently. But his legacy lives on, Aldrich replied, gesturing vaguely toward the crown that sat on a cushion nearby. In every decree I issue, in every judgment I render, in the fear I see in people's eyes when they approach the throne. He turned to her fully now, something raw and desperate in his gaze. I became what he couldn't break, something already broken, with edges sharp enough to cut anyone who came too close. Ilara moved toward him, drawn by the pain evident in every line of his body. And is that why you've kept me at a distance? To prevent me from being cut by those edges. To prevent you from suffering Isabel's fate, he corrected quietly. The court watches, always. My father may be dead, but those who served him remain, embedded in the castle like ticks beneath the skin. Rain continued its relentless assault on the windows, but within the chamber, a different kind of storm brewed, one of confession and consequence, of truths too long hidden finally finding voice. Ilara stood before her husband, seeing him truly for perhaps the first time. Not the cruel king of legend, not the grieving widower at Isabel's portrait, but the complex, damaged man caught between past and present, between the ruler he had become and the man he had once hoped to be. What do you want from me, Aldrich? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He studied her face in the firelight, searching for something. Mockery, perhaps, or fear. Finding neither, his expression softened almost imperceptibly. I don't know, he admitted, the confession clearly costing him. I haven't allowed myself to want anything since Isabel died. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks dancing upward. In that brief illumination, Elara saw vulnerability written plainly across features usually schooled to reveal nothing. Without thinking, she reached out, her fingertips brushing his cheek in the lightest of touches. "Then perhaps," she suggested softly, "it's time to remember how." He caught her hand before she could withdraw it, his grip firm but not painful. For several heartbeats, they remained thus connected, the simple contact more intimate than any embrace could have been. His eyes, when they met hers, contained a warning, even as something like hope flickered in their depths. "If you knew who I really am," he whispered, "you would flee before dawn." Dawn crept into the chamber like a hesitant visitor, pale fingers of light stretching across stone floors still damp from the night's storm. Elara woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings. The heavy curtains of Aldrich's bed cast the space in shadow, but the weight beside her confirmed she hadn't dreamed the night's revelations. For the first time since their wedding, they had shared a bed, not as man and wife in the physical sense, but as two souls seeking comfort in proximity. No barriers of propriety or pretense remained between them, though other walls still stood, waiting to be dismantled. Beside her, Aldrich slept fitfully, his brow furrowed even in unconsciousness. One hand clutched the edge of the blanket as if afraid it might be torn away, knuckles white with tension. In sleep, stripped of the careful control he maintained while awake, his face betrayed vulnerabilities never shown to the court. The slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, the rapid movement beneath closed eyelids, the occasional soft sound of distress that escaped his throat. Watching him, Elara felt something shift within her chest, pity transforming into something more complex, more dangerous. She had entered this marriage expecting a monster, and found instead a man whose wounds ran deeper than she could have imagined. A man who had chosen cruelty not from inclination, but from desperate self-preservation. As if sensing her scrutiny, Aldrich's eyes snapped open. For a disorienting moment, confusion clouded his features. Then recognition dawned, followed immediately by wariness. He sat up abruptly, putting physical distance between them, the vulnerability of sleep replaced by the careful mask she had come to recognize. "You stayed," he observed, voice rough with sleep and something that might have been surprise. "You didn't send me away," Elara countered softly. A muscle tightened in his jaw as he swung his legs over the edge of the bed, his back to her. "Last night was a mistake," he said, the words clipped. "I spoke of things better left buried." "Or perhaps not buried deeply enough," she suggested, pushing herself upright. "Secrets fester in darkness, Aldrich, like wounds left untended." His shoulders stiffened at the analogy, hands clenching on the edge of the mattress. "Some wounds cannot be healed," he responded, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Some secrets must remain hidden for everyone's protection, including your own," Elara pressed, emboldened by the intimacy of their conversation the night before. "What are you hiding that requires such elaborate deception? What weakness could possibly justify the mask you wear?" For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, with a movement that suggested bone-deep weariness, Aldrich rose and crossed to the window. Morning light illuminated his profile, strong, regal, carved from the same unyielding stone as the castle itself. Only his eyes betrayed the conflict raging within. "My father was the strongest king in 3 generations, he began, gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Physically imposing, mentally formidable. A warrior who ruled through sheer force of will and the fear his presence inspired. His fingers traced an absent pattern on the windowsill. He expected his heir to embody those same qualities. Something in his voice raised the fine hairs on Elara's arms, a current of old terror, of memories that still had power to wound. She remained silent, afraid any interruption might cause him to retreat behind his walls once more. "I was born different." The confession emerged reluctantly, each word seeming to cost him physically. "Smaller than expected, weaker. The midwife told my mother I wouldn't survive the week." A bitter smile touched his lips. "My father considered it a personal affront, as if I had deliberately chosen to disappoint him before I could even speak." Elara slid from the bed, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the morning chill. She moved closer but didn't touch him, intuiting that physical contact might shatter the fragile trust allowing this revelation. As a child, I suffered from fits. Aldrich continued, voice dropping lower. Moments when my body would betray me, muscles seizing, consciousness fleeing. My father called it weakness of character, a failing of will. He believed such episodes could be beaten out of me, trained away through discipline and punishment. Horror bloomed in Alara's chest as understanding dawned. The falling sickness, she whispered, naming the condition her village healer had described in hushed tones, a mysterious affliction believed by many to be a divine curse, a mark of the devil's touch. Aldrich nodded once, the movement sharp with shame. A king who collapses before his court, who foams at the mouth and thrashes like a dying fish. How long would such a monarch maintain his throne? How quickly would enemies move against a ruler proven defective? His laugh held no humor, only decades of suppressed bitterness. My father made this very clear, daily, for years. But surely as you grew older, Ilara began. I learned to hide it, he interrupted, to feel the warning signs and remove myself before the worst could happen. To explain sudden absences as royal prerogative rather than physical necessity. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. And then I met Isabel. The name hung between them, weighted with significance. She knew, Ilara guessed softly. She discovered by accident, Aldrich confirmed. Found me during an episode when I couldn't reach privacy in time. Instead of disgust or fear, she showed. His voice faltered. Compassion, understanding. She researched ancient texts, consulted healers in secret. She believed the condition need not define me as king. And your father discovered her knowledge, Ilara concluded, the pieces falling into terrible place. Aldrich turned to face her fully, the morning light casting half his face in shadow. My father believed vulnerability of any kind was unacceptable in a king. The moment he realized Isabel knew my secret, that she encouraged me to accept it rather than hide it, she became a threat to everything he had built. His voice cracked slightly. Her death was not quick, and I was made to watch, to understand the consequences of weakness. The horror of this revelation stole Ilara's breath. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears welling unbidden. Not for herself, but for the young prince who had lost everything in one brutal lesson, for the man who had surrendered his true self to survive. Afterward, Aldrich continued, each word measured and precise, I became what my father demanded. Cruel, unyielding, a king who ruled through fear rather than respect. I buried the sickness deep, taking medicines that dull my mind but control the fits. I eliminated anyone who knew of my condition or suspected it. I became the monster my father believed a true king should be. And no one knows? Ilara whispered. No one at all? Thaddeus suspects but has never witnessed an episode. 2 personal guards know only that I sometimes require privacy for meditation. No one else. His eyes, when they met hers, contained equal parts warning and despair. Until now. The weight of this knowledge settled over Ilara like a physical burden. The cruel king was not cruel by nature, but by calculated design, a facade created to protect a vulnerability that, if exposed, could destroy everything. The fear she had seen in him wasn't fear of losing power, but of revealing the very human frailty beneath the crown. Now you understand, Aldrich said quietly. Now you know why this distance between us is necessary. A queen who knows her king's weakness becomes either a threat or a target. Ilara moved toward him slowly, deliberate in each step. Or an ally, she suggested, voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs. A partner rather than a pawn. Something dangerous flashed in his eyes, hope perhaps, or its equally treacherous cousin, fear. My father destroyed the last woman who offered that, he reminded her, voice harsh with warning. Your father is dead, Ilara countered, stopping just before him. And I am not Isabel. For a heartbeat, they stood suspended between past and possibility, the ghost of his first wife and the potential of his second hanging in the air between them. Then Aldrich stepped back, rebuilding the walls she had glimpsed beyond. Court begins in an hour, he said, voice resuming its royal inflection. We should prepare separately. The crown expects its performance. Later that morning, Alara entered the great hall after Aldrich was already seated. The court assembled in its usual configuration of sycophants and power seekers. She took her place beside him on the slightly smaller throne, feeling the weight of curious gazes tracking her movement. Something had changed in the air of court. Rumors of their private conversation had clearly spread, speculation rampant about what transpired between king and queen behind closed doors. As petitioners approached with grievances and requests, Ilara observed Aldrich with new understanding. The slight tremor in his left hand when he gripped the throne's armrest. Not anger, as she had previously assumed, but perhaps the warning sign of an impending episode. The way his jaw tightened when crowds pressed too close, not arrogance but anxiety. The coldness in his voice when interrupted, not cruelty for its own sake, but desperate maintenance of control. When a dispute between two merchants grew heated, voices raising in the echoing chamber, she saw it happen. A barely perceptible flinch, a momentary absence in his eyes, the first symptoms of what he had spent a lifetime concealing. Without conscious thought, without calculating consequence, Ilara reached across the small space separating their thrones. Her fingers found his, warm against the cold metal of his rings. She felt the initial tension in his hand, the instinct to pull away warring with something deeper. Then, as the court watched in collective held breath, King Aldrich turned his palm upward and closed his fingers around hers. The kingdom held its breath. For 7 days, whispers raced through the castle corridors like wildfire, consuming everything in their path. The queen had touched the king's hand in public, not a ceremonial gesture but something intimate, almost protective, and he had allowed it. More shocking still, he had returned it, his fingers interlacing with hers before the entire court. No one quite knew what to make of this unprecedented display. Some courtiers speculated that the cruel king had finally claimed his bride in truth. Others whispered of enchantments and manipulation. The most daring wondered if perhaps the monster they had feared for so long might possess a heart after all. For Ilara, these 7 days had brought transformation both terrifying and exhilarating. Each night since the revelation of Aldrich's secret, they had shared not only chambers, but conversations that stretched until dawn painted the sky. His voice, when they were alone, had shed the cutting edge it carried in public, revealing cadences of thought and feeling she had never imagined possible. He spoke of his childhood, of rare moments of kindness from his mother before her early death, of dreams abandoned under his father's cruel tutelage, of hopes so long buried he struggled to articulate them. In turn, she shared her own stories, the simple joys of village life, the terror of being selected as royal bride, the gradual shift from fearing him to something far more complex and dangerous. Neither used the word love. Such confession remained beyond reach, but something equally powerful grew between them nonetheless. Understanding, trust, possibility. During daylight hours they maintained the careful performance expected by court. Aldrich issued judgments with the same stern authority he had always wielded, yet subtle changes appeared to those watching closely. Where once he might have ordered 20 lashes for a servant's mistake, he now commanded 10. Where execution had been the punishment for theft from the royal stores, he now decreed imprisonment. Small mercies, perhaps, but mercies nonetheless. On the 8th morning, Ilara woke to find Aldrich already dressed, standing before the window with hands clasped behind his back. His posture betrayed tension, shoulders rigid beneath his formal attire. When he turned at her movement, his expression held none of the openness she had come to treasure in their private moments. "What troubles you?" she asked, pushing herself upright. "Lord Herrick returns to court today," he replied, voice carefully neutral. "My father's most trusted advisor, the man who held Isabel while my father—" He stopped abruptly, jaw tightening against memories too painful to voice. Cold dread settled in Ilara's stomach. "He knows your secret," she guessed. "He helped create the necessity for it," Aldrich corrected bitterly. "After Isabel's death, he was the one who suggested I embrace cruelty as strength, who convinced my father I could rule effectively if properly motivated by fear. He has served as royal physician since before my birth. He mixes the medicines that control my fits. You allow this man access to your person, to your medicines. Alara couldn't keep horror from her voice. After what he did, Aldrich's laugh held no humor. What choice do I have? He knows everything. My condition, my weakness. Without his concoctions, the falling sickness would become apparent within days. I would be revealed before the entire court as defective, unworthy. So you remain his prisoner, Alara said softly. Still controlled by your father's will, even from the grave. Something flashed in Aldrich's eyes. Anger, perhaps, or the first stirrings of rebellion. What would you have me do? Expose myself? Invite chaos and challenge to the throne? Alara rose from the bed, drawing a robe around herself as she crossed to stand before him. I would have you be the king you were meant to be, not your father's puppet, not the cruel mask you've worn so long it's scarred your soul. Just Aldrich, the man strong enough to rule with justice rather than fear. His hands rose to grasp her shoulders, grip almost painful in its intensity. Such idealism nearly destroyed me once, he warned, voice dropping to a harsh whisper. It killed Isabel. And what has survival cost you? She challenged, refusing to look away from the conflict raging in his eyes. How much of yourself have you sacrificed to maintain this deception? What kind of life have you been living, Aldrich? The questions struck him like physical blows, each one landing with precision born of truth. His hands fell away from her shoulders, fingers curling into fists at his sides. For several heartbeats, silence stretched between them. Not the comfortable quiet they had come to share in recent nights, but something taut with decision. I don't know how to be any other king, he finally admitted, the confession seeming to deflate him. I've spent so long becoming this version of myself, I'm not certain anything else remains. Alara's hand rose to cup his cheek, feeling the slight roughness of morning stubble beneath her palm. Then perhaps it's time to find out, she suggested softly. Court that day hummed with anticipation. Lord Herrick's return after 3 months negotiating border treaties brought a shift in the chamber's usual dynamics. Tall and gaunt, with fingers like pale spiders and eyes that missed nothing, he took his position at the king's right hand, as if he had never left. His presence seemed to cast a shadow over Aldrich, whose jaw tightened visibly at the older man's proximity. Alara, seated on Aldrich's left, felt rather than saw the change in her husband as petitioners approached with the day's business. His voice regained its cutting edge, judgments harsher than they had been in recent days. The mask of the cruel king slipped back into place with disturbing ease under Herrick's watchful gaze. As the morning progressed, she noticed something else. Aldrich's left hand, hidden from the court's view by the throne's armrest, had begun to tremble. Not the slight shakiness she had observed before, but violent tremors he could barely control. Sweat beaded along his hairline, despite the chamber's chill. Twice, he seemed to lose the thread of a petitioner's request, gaze going distant before snapping back with visible effort. The warning signs he had described were unmistakable. An episode approached, here now before the assembled court, with his father's creature watching for exactly this weakness. Acting on instinct rather than calculation, Alara rose suddenly from her throne. My lords and ladies, she announced, voice ringing clear in the vaulted chamber. The king and I must attend to an urgent private matter. Court will resume after the midday meal. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the assembly. No one interrupted royal court, not even the queen. Yet before objections could form, Alara had already moved to Aldrich's side, her hand extended in clear invitation. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, he stared at her offered hand, conflict raging behind eyes increasingly unfocused. Your Majesty, Lord Herrick interjected smoothly, stepping forward. Perhaps I might assist with your medication before. The king requires only his queen at present. Alara cut him off, gaze never leaving Aldrich's face. Isn't that right, my lord? Something shifted in Aldrich's expression, fear giving way to a decision that transformed his features. With visible effort, he rose from the throne, took her hand, and addressed the stunned courtiers. My wife speaks truth, he stated, voice remarkably steady, despite the tremors now visibly affecting his entire left side. "We will return shortly." Together they moved from the dais, Ilara supporting his increasingly unsteady steps as whispers erupted behind them. They had nearly reached the private royal exit when Aldrich's knees buckled. She caught him as best she could, bearing his weight against her smaller frame as they passed beyond public view. In the antechamber beyond, away from watching eyes, he surrendered to the seizure that had been building. His body convulsed, muscles rigid, then violently trembling, a hoarse sound escaping his throat as consciousness fled. Ilara cradled his head in her lap, preventing injury as the episode ran its course, whispering soothing nonsense he couldn't hear but might somehow sense. When it ended, leaving him exhausted but aware, the fear she expected to see in his eyes was absent. Instead, a strange peace had settled over his features. "They saw," he whispered, voice rough. "They must have noticed something was wrong. They saw their king and queen attending to private matters," Ilara corrected gently. "Nothing more." "Herrick knows," Aldrich insisted. "He recognized the signs." "And what will he do?" she challenged. "Tell the court their king sometimes falls? That the man they've feared for a decade has a human vulnerability?" Her fingers brushed damp hair from his forehead. "Perhaps it's time they knew, not as weakness, but as truth." Fear flashed across his face. "My father is dead," she interrupted firmly, "and his cruelty died with him. It's time to bury the rest, Aldrich. The lies, the fear. The mask you've worn so long it's poisoned you from within." When they returned to court that afternoon, whispers died abruptly as the royal couple entered together. Ilara felt the weight of every gaze, the speculation behind each carefully blank expression. Aldrich moved with deliberate dignity to his throne, seemingly recovered though significantly paler than before. Lord Herrick approached immediately, a small vial of dark liquid extended in one spidery hand. "Your medicine, Your Majesty," he murmured, voice pitched for privacy. "I noticed signs of your discomfort earlier." Aldrich stared at the familiar concoction, the dulling potion that controlled his fits at the cost of his clarity, the liquid chain that had bound him to his father's legacy for years. His hand rose, hesitated, then bypassed the vial entirely to grasp Herrick's wrist instead. "No more," he stated, voice quiet but firm. "I will not hide behind potions and pretense any longer." Shock registered on the older man's face, followed swiftly by calculation. "Your Majesty must consider the consequences. If the court should witness an episode, then they will see their king as he truly is," Aldrich replied. "A man with a physical ailment that affects his body occasionally but not his mind or his capacity to rule." His grip tightened on Herrick's wrist. "And they will know that this condition does not make me weak, just as they will know my father's cruelty did not make him strong." Color drained from Herrick's face. "The late king's methods ensured stability." "The late king's methods ensured fear," Aldrich corrected, rising from his throne. Though still pale from his recent seizure, he seemed to stand taller than before, as if shedding a weight carried too long. "I will not rule as he did. Not anymore." His gaze swept the assembled court, taking in the stunned expressions, the uncertain murmurs. "My lords and ladies," he announced, voice carrying to the farthest corners of the hall. "For too long this kingdom has lived under the shadow of cruelty disguised as strength. Today, that changes." Beside him, Ilara watched transformation unfold. Not the violent seizure of illness, but something far more profound. With each word that followed, each truth revealed, the cruel king receded, and in his place emerged a ruler both vulnerable and powerful, human and royal, flawed and magnificent. When he extended his hand to her before the entire court, the gesture carried meaning beyond political alliance or marital duty. As her fingers interlaced with his, something unexpected happened. Aldrich smiled. Not the cold, calculated expression he had perfected for state functions, but something genuine that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. In that moment of connection, both understood the truth that would define their reign together. True power lay not in cruelty or fear, not in perfect strength or the absence of weakness, but in the courage to be human in a world that demanded gods. Behind every mask of cruelty lies a story untold. King Aldric's journey from feared tyrant to vulnerable leader reminds us that people are rarely what they first appear to be. How many times have we judged others without knowing their hidden battles? How often do we ourselves wear masks, afraid to show our true vulnerabilities to a world that might use them against us? Perhaps the greatest courage isn't found in strength or power, but in the willingness to be seen, truly seen, despite our deepest fears. Ilara's compassion changed more than just her husband. It transformed an entire kingdom. When faced with someone broken by pain and fear, would you have the courage to reach past their defenses? Would you risk your own safety to help someone find their way back to themselves? In a world that often rewards cruelty with power, sometimes the most revolutionary act is simple human kindness, seeing the person behind the pain, the possibility beneath the brokenness. If this story touched your heart, remember that sharing it might help someone else who needs to hear its message. Like and subscribe to join our community of storytellers and listeners, where we explore the complex truths of human experience through tales that remind us we're never alone in our struggles. After all, every one of us has parts of ourselves we hide from the world, and every one of us deserves the chance to be truly known.